turns out it's okay. Some property damage. Thank God nobody was hurt or injured. So, but beautiful day since then. So welcome to the 2024 legislative session, the 446th gathering of the Maryland General Assembly. Again, kind of a remarkable thing, but just sort of speaks to the historic nature of this place. I know it is not as comfortable potentially as it used to be. We've got a lot of construction going on, but by the 2025 session, we're going to have a brand new building, wholly refurbished. We're going to have a new Department of Legislative Services building. We're having the tunnels reopened, but this is our, pardon our dust for the construction. It will be better soon, but it is a testament to this is just as we're rebuilding the buildings and making sure that everything is fit and tight. I think that's kind of the same narrative that we'll have for this session this year. This is a session about governance. It's about normalizing, getting back to what is a more normal state for the state of Maryland. There's a lot of talk about the budget. It's our most important item. It's our one constitutional duty. We're not allowed out of here until we pass a balanced budget. And so that is going to be the most important thing that we do. The talk has largely been about the drop in revenues. I would say this is a much more normalized budget. We're getting back to normal. So where we had 3 years of truly extraordinary revenues and support from the federal government, and a lot more flexible funding and changes in the economy of working from home and telework and virtual school. I think this 2024 General Assembly session is really going to be characterized as this is getting back to normal. And we feel that with revenues, and we're going to have to feel it with expenditures because our number one thing is to balance. We are going to have to be fiscally prudent, and we're going to have to get back into the habit of really sharpening our pencils and prioritizing what matters most for the 6.5 million Marylanders that count on us. We are fortunate in Maryland to have a $62 billion budget. We have more in our rainy day and cash reserves than we've ever had. We planned for this. We planned that we were not going to have that extraordinary federal revenue for years and years and years. And so we stockpiled cash to make sure that we would be prepared either for a downturn or for situations like this where our revenues underpace expenditures. And so this is a year of tightening things up. As we look forward, this is also a year of trying to project places where we can trim on the edges for future costs. We have to make sure that we're investing in the things that matter most: education, public safety, healthcare, protecting our environment, and we will. But we also have to look closely at every program that we're currently funding and making sure that it's getting the results that we desire and that Marylanders expect. We have to watch every penny, and we have to prioritize. And if something's not working, we got to cut it and reallocate those funds towards higher priority items. And so I think this is a normal process for the legislature. This is what we do. We previously only had the ability to cut, and so this is not a new thing for what the legislature is going to have the ability to reinvest in. There are going to be a number of different policy issues that we are taking on this year. Our number one goal is to create a safer and stronger Maryland. We have to set ourselves up for growth, and we have to make sure that we are remaining competitive, not just in the region, not just nationally, but globally. And so you cannot be a safe and strong competitive state unless people feel safe. We have work to do this year to make sure, particularly when it comes to young people with guns who are using those guns to shoot other young people or are the victims of firearms, or are using those firearms to rob others or carjack and steal cars. It's got to stop. And we have to do whatever we can to make sure that in that targeted, segmented area where we are struggling with young people, that we do the things that are necessary to provide the right supports, the right accountability, and the right systems for engaging at the right times. I will say, and I think it's really important, the context of this work is around three big things that exist. And for those of you who were there earlier this morning, I sort of went into, I won't go into it in as much detail, but I think young people today are facing things that no other young people in the history of humanity have ever had to face. A 100-year pandemic coming out of, in which the whole world was shaken up, in which they were in some cases, especially those kids who are the most at risk, were out of school for a year. Got into habits that were not good for their own development and for their own, not just academic development, but personal growth. We have more guns. Second thing is we have more guns in society and in the United States than we have ever had per capita in the history of this country. There are more guns bought and sold in the last 2 years than ever. The reality is, in that whatever anybody thinks about guns, one way or the other, if there are more guns in the stream of commerce, it means more guns are lost and stolen, and it means that more guns that are lost and stolen find their way into the hands of young people. That's what we're dealing with, and that is just an objective fact. It is the reason why, for the first time in American history, the #1 cause of death of 0 to 18-year-olds in the United States is death by firearm. The cost of the number of guns in our stream of commerce is that more kids are dying. That's just the truth. The third factor that makes all of this as complicated is that we have a social media environment. Kids are faced with the pressures around social media and use that is impacting every aspect of their lives. How they engage with one another, their reward systems, their brain development, their brain chemistry, you name it. Social media has created a whole new exacerbated level. So you take COVID, guns, and social media, and you throw them together into this environment for kids that have not had the supports and are facing a number of different barriers. Sadly, that's the reality of what we're seeing in the derivation of what we're struggling with. It can't continue. We have to find our way through. But this is a unique moment, and we have to provide the right resources and supports to make sure that kids are held accountable, that they get the right services to change their behavior, and their families have the right supports, and that communities feel safe. It's essential. It's essential for remaining competitive and for building our economy. The other area where we have to become stronger is around pricing and the pressure that people are feeling in their pocketbooks. The #1 driver of inflation is the price of housing. We've seen this across the country. I just recently visited Minneapolis, in which Minneapolis expanded the amount of affordable housing faster than almost any other MSA region in the country. They were the first urban area to get below 2% inflation. Why? Because they increased housing costs were reduced, it drives inflation. And so it's not just the person that buys or sells or accesses that house, which is excellent, it's for everybody else where is benefiting when housing costs are lower, because it reduces the cost of goods and services generally. And so we have to, this year in this session, make sure that we have a robust, and we will have a robust housing package that will invest in increasing supply and changing the policies that make it difficult and more expensive to build here in Maryland. Two other small little issues, and then open it up for questions. Well, I wouldn't say they're small. I shouldn't call them small. We're going to be fighting for democracy this year. This is an important year in the context of what is going to be a pretty challenging federal political environment. I'm pleased. I was certainly worried ahead of this the winter break about what would happen in D.C. Maryland is very reliant on the federal budget and what happens. In many ways, we have a number of federal contractors, we have a number of federal employees, and so when the federal government is shut down, Maryland really suffers disproportionately to others. I was very pleased and frankly surprised to see a deal reached between the chambers. Now we have to see it passed. We have only a few days left. I believe it's about 9 days until the deadline hits, and we just have to find a way to make sure that government keeps running. That is a basic, fundamental principle of the social contract. I feel confident, given that the deal has been reached, that we'll find a way through, but that was sort of an outstanding issue. And we have a federal election coming up in 2024 that's really going to strain the fabric of democracy. This is something that we have to be mindful of as we are legislating this year, and so we are going to look for additional opportunities here in Maryland to expand democracy, to return the right to vote and pick, giving Marylanders the right to pick their own representatives. This is an issue around special elections that the Senate has passed before that you'll see again. And this is all in the context of making sure that we here in Maryland are doing our part and to save democracy. And so this is an important issue moving forward. And then another issue I just want to highlight that has been up for a while, but is certainly probably going to get a vote this year in the Senate, is medical aid in dying. And this is a very, very hard issue. It was probably in the 13 years that I've served in the legislature, probably the hardest issue that we debated on the Senate floor about 4 years ago. And so we have not brought it back up until we thought that it was the timing was right. It's going to be a hard issue. It's a personal issue. It's not a partisan issue in any way. This is one where individuals' personal experiences really drive where they land on this. And so I do expect it to be a topic of important conversation this year. I believe it will pass the Senate, and we'll see what happens moving forward. So with that, let me go ahead and open it up to Dave. Mm-hmm.
What is the criteria to determine, going back to the budget, what is the criteria to determine spending priorities? At least in the Senate.
Yeah, number one is going to be about, are we setting ourselves up for future growth? That has to be the key priority. Is this program ensuring that we are creating a safer and stronger, more competitive Maryland? We have to make sure that as we look as a region, that we are reducing costs so that we can be a place where people want to come. You know, I was just at the Senate President's Forum last week and was meeting with a number, I think it was about 27 other presiding officers from Senate chambers across the country. And the majority of them were talking about ways that they are anticipating the likely tax cuts. That's not the position that we're in, but we have to be very realistic and mindful of the context in which we are operating. And so if we are a place where our cost of doing business is higher, and objectively that is the case, then we also have to say that we have the best services in the country. And so if there are instances where those services are not matching the exceptionally high expectations that Marylanders should have, they either we need to move away from them and invest in other things, or we have to figure out immediate ways to improve them. And so how we can remain competitive is certainly number two. And then I would say the third is really around our core principles. I mean, we are making sure that we are investing in things that set us up for the long term. The market and private actors are going to take care of the short-term issues. We want entrepreneurs dealing with the short-term challenges that society may have. Government exists to deal with the long term. And so we have to invest in an education system that's moving kids, families, and young adults into better opportunity. We've got to create safe communities with law enforcement and that they have the resources that they need. We have to protect our land, our air, our water, and mitigate the impacts of climate change, and protect our environment. And we have to make sure that people are healthy. We have an incredible hospital system. We have incredible healthcare practitioners in the state of Maryland. We're blessed with this. And so we will make sure that sort of that third component is ensuring that our priorities are fully funded and maintained.
In the same vein of budgeting, do you envision the Senate supporting any sort of tax increases or fee increases that could impact the public?
I don't see any need for wholesale tax increases in any way. You know, look, I think that it's really important that we're mindful. As I was sort of saying in other states that are looking at cuts, you know, Maryland provides more services than many other states. And so we have a more robust budget, but we have to be competitive. And so that's something that's really going to drive. I think it's more important that we look towards sharpening our pencils and maintaining with the resources that we have this year. That said, I think there are a couple areas where we may have to look at special funds and whether or not they're meeting the funding level that would be expected. And a prime example of that is the trauma funding. So we have in Maryland this incredible trauma system. We are the envy of the country and the globe of our trauma system, with shock trauma in Baltimore, but also the trauma system statewide, and with our helicopter system and our urgent care. We have one of the best in the world. The challenge is to maintain that trauma system. The money that comes in through fees is not covering the cost to operate it. And so this is something that the legislature is almost certainly going to move forward this year, is figuring out a fee structure and the appropriate fees that can be allocated specifically for the trauma system. So it's not a whole-scale general fund. It's looking, how do we make sure that the costs of that trauma system are being covered by the fees that are related? And so we're looking at ways to tie those revenues to match what's needed.
When you're talking about climate change, I know MDE rolled out the plan. They said it's going to cost about $1 billion, and included in that to pay for it were proposals including fee increases for that. Would the Senate support some of those? You know,
I haven't seen the very specifics. I don't foresee us doing significant fee increases in that way for that purpose. I think all of this has to be done. It's not in a vacuum, right? So any fee that happens or that's being proposed in a report that is just about climate change issues, well, there are other priorities as well that are looking at increased cost is similar to the cost that we're going to have to spend for climate change. So I would say certainly this year there needs to be better coordination and thought around what dollars are being allocated for the purposes of mitigating climate change. I don't see us increasing specific fees or a new tax related to that this year, but we're going to have a conversation about this realistically. You know, you look last night, with a January hurricane and the flooding that was happening in my own district, in the 46th district, downtown in Annapolis, we have to look at this in a balanced approach. We're going to have to spend to mitigate future carbon emissions, which has to do with moving towards a more fuel efficient and more green energy production. But also, we're going to have to spend on resiliency, and I think that is an enormous cost around that we have to take into account. It's not just about changing towards more clean energy generation. It's also about building up the infrastructure so that we are more resilient for storms like this that sadly are going to be coming more and more frequently. And so, that said, and I go back to that second principle, we have to be competitive too. We cannot be the only state in the country that is expecting to cover all of these costs because it will just make us uncompetitive to our surrounding jurisdictions. And so that's going to be an important feature here. I think the story of what you'll see out of the Senate is about balance and finding ways to balance really important interests, both of which are important, but they have to be balanced, and that's what good policymaking is. It's not being evangelistic about a certain thing. It's about how do you balance to move the ball down the field.
Could you talk about transportation funding in the Senate, coming after the transportation revenues commissions that were released earlier this month?
Yeah, and this was an interim report that was released. For those of you who hadn't seen, this is our TRAIN Commission, the Transportation Revenues and Infrastructure Needs Report, or Commission. So the TRAIN Commission put forward a number of recommendations around prioritization, a few little revenue things around electric vehicles and potential tolls. What's most important, I think, this year is being clear to Marylanders, should there be additional dollars, and with the dollars that we have, how are we prioritizing investments in our transportation infrastructure? Maryland is unique in that we have this transportation trust fund where all transportation dollars are in one bucket. So airport, port, roads, bridges, transit systems, trains, all of it gets funded out of the same bucket. And I think one of the challenges is showing that if additional money goes into that fund, how are we going to prioritize moving forward? Are we going to invest more in mass transit, in roads and bridges, and in making our port more competitive? And how are those decisions going to happen? So, or what are the characteristics and criteria? And so this year, I think it's important that we really spend time making the case of how additional revenue, should they materialize, how they would be spent. And then we'll give the TRAIN Commission another year to really think, if we have, actually, let me just pause for a second. The good news is we have sufficient dollars to maintain our current infrastructure. So it is not, if we do not want any expansion, we have sufficient money. That's a good thing. We're not talking about a crisis where we can't even maintain our roads and bridges. The challenge is, I don't think that that's the best thing to make us competitive in the future. We're going to have to invest more to make it more efficient to move people, goods, and services in the state of Maryland. And so that's what, moving forward, we're going to have to pay for it if we're going to do any enhancements. That's not this session, but for the upcoming year, this commission will be charged with figuring out if we do need additional investments to enhance and build further out our infrastructure. We've got to pay for it in a way that is equitable and thoughtful. And so we'll take that up a year from now after the commission's had a chance to really review what might be feasible.
Senator Ferguson.
Oh, go ahead. And then it goes.
Okay. In the past, in regard to juvenile justice, you've spoken about the need for cohesion among different agencies. You've talked about how that could probably be done via executive order. Yesterday, the governor introduced his criminal justice bills that had nothing to do with a cohesive, mechanism for monitoring the agencies that children are involved with. Is that something that you think will have to be done legislatively? Have there been conversations with the governor about moving forward with an executive order?
I think there's still efforts in place to work on how different agencies that impact kids and families will collaborate together. What used to be Office of Children and Families, Governor's Office of Children, Youth and Families. I know that the governor is still working on that effort, and the secretaries are in communication on a weekly basis about moving that forward. It hasn't happened yet, but I do know while they're working on the potential of an executive order, they're still trying to build up the muscle capacity to better collaborate. It's critical. It is absolutely essential in the juvenile system, and especially as we're worried about kids with guns. And these are kids. Many of these young people are those young people who have had some of the most traumatic and horrific things happen in their lives. That does not excuse their behavior, but it does help to explain it. And the only way forward is to address to have the accountable programs that are addressing those stimuli that created that behavior in the first place. That's not just going to come from Department of Juvenile Services. It's going to come from the Department of Health in some cases, from the Department of Human Resources. And so I know that the governor's office is very focused on creating a better system of collaboration. I'm hopeful that we'll see an executive order and daily functioning improve soon, and that there will be more action there soon. I do think that some of the programs that the governor announced were good programs that I think are effective. I think we have to make sure that we are actually this is a prime example of making sure that we're investing in diversion programs that are actually getting results. You look at the UMBC Choice program. It's about 350 kids per year. They have a success rate of 98% of kids that are in the UMBC Choice program do not get arrested, or I think it's 99%, 98% do not receive charges, 99% are not rearrested. And so, this is a program that works. We should be expanding the investment in those types of programs that understand how to provide those in-depth wraparound supports and accountability to change kids' behaviors. And so we are looking to invest further in those and hold the system accountable. We work very closely with the governor's office, but the legislature also has a job to do. We are an oversight body. And we are looking with our House counterparts at ways that we can make sure that we are looking at that everyday oversight and accountability of the daily operations of what happens within juvenile services and the various agencies to get better results. I just mentioned a story of a 16-year-old who was recently killed in the city, who was arrested in August of 2023 on auto theft and was released without diversion. Then was arrested again in November, released without diversion and no programming for auto theft. Was arrested in December of 23, this time was released on an ankle monitor until a case could be formalized. That child is now dead because was killed in the streets, presumably while trying to engage in another auto theft. That is the case study example of a system breaking down that is horrible for kids and horrible for communities. And so we have to hold the everyday executive functions accountable to doing the job of following the law and engaging in the real work that is required every single day to change outcomes for kids.
Just a very quick follow-up. Yesterday during his press conference, the governor also suggested that lawmakers consider policy changes to gun or firearm charges by changing certain consequences from misdemeanors to felonies. I know that's been a sticking point in some conversations in prior legislative sessions. Is that something that would?
I mean, look, the Senate has passed legislation related to that in multiple occasions. But I've said every time that we've passed it, I think there is something specific around firearm crimes. I think there are enhanced penalties. I am personally supportive of enhanced penalties around firearms crimes because I think we are facing a crisis when it comes to firearms generally. And it has to be clear that we are sending a message that if you are using a firearm and to engage in chaos in a community, it can't continue. It doesn't matter if you're a kid, if you're an adult, it doesn't matter. And so that is something I've been personally supportive of. However, I know for a fact it doesn't solve the problem on its own. It takes everyday execution and collaboration to both prevent, intervene, hold people accountable, and rehabilitate. All four matter. And so, I know the governor said he personally supports it. It's something I've personally supported the Senate to move forward. If it's part of a larger package of things, I think it's something that we'd explore. But, I don't want the debate to get stuck and focused on whether or not we increase a penalty or change a misdemeanor to a felony, because at the end of the day, I just don't think that individual who has decided to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is contemplating, is this a felony or a misdemeanor, or is this 6 months or a year? I just think it's more complex than that. And by the time the person's carrying the gun to go commit the murder in the first place, all that's out the window. And so we've got to have a more comprehensive approach.
Senate President, in your conversation about juvenile justice earlier, you talked about the importance of execution and implementation in addition to what the content of the bill is. And in the case of the 16-year-old, knowing that and thinking about that idea, what would you have done differently?
Yep, great question. It's the intake process. I think that is where we've had a huge challenge. And this is something in the city, but I don't think it's exclusive to the city. we have to make sure that everyone's rights are protected. We have to make sure that when a child breaks the law, that the right services are swiftly provided to intervene as quickly as possible. And I think what we've seen happen too often is that at the point of intake, when the police have done their jobs of making an arrest, somebody's broken the law, there's enough evidence to make the arrest and probable cause and brought to the juvenile facility. Too often we've seen young people lost within the system after that point. And that has to change. It has to change. We have to have a more targeted impact on when a 16-year-old is arrested for auto theft, things are not going well. And there has to be the mindset of not just checking a box of, we did the screening and we're just gonna send it to diversion. There has to be the question of what does this child need to change his or her behavior, because it can't continue like this. And that happens in that intake process. And it's a complicated process between law enforcement, the Department of Juvenile Services, and ideally what we'll see will be the state's attorney's office having a conversation about what services are needed, and likely the public defender's office too, because I think it's important that the child have their own representation as well. That has to be geared not towards I did my job or you do your job. It has to be about what are each of us doing to make sure this doesn't happen again. And I think that's what's different in the juvenile system that is not the case in the adult system, which is a much more adversarial system. When it comes to the juvenile system, it's got to be about how do we stop this behavior.
In the intake process, I know some of the state's attorneys have come out with their legislative priorities. One, it talks about removing the guessing nature of the intake process for certain crimes and putting that in the hands of a judge or a judicial magistrate. Would you support that proposal as well?
I have to understand that one a little bit better, because I don't exactly know how that would work, because there's not a judge or intake officer immediately available, not a judge or a magistrate immediately available in many cases, particularly overnight. And so because of protections around juveniles in custody, I'm not exactly sure how it would work. And so I do think that there has to be a clearer process, particularly with young people who have firearms. I think that this is something that we have to be very targeted and specific about, that if a young person is picked up with a firearm and has engaged in some sort of criminal behavior with that firearm, there is a different approach at the point of intake and immediate service provision. We have to be more urgent in the delivery of the accountability for that young person, as well for the community that has experienced that harm.
Senator,
Oh, sorry, Sue. Yes, I'm sorry.
on the matter of affordable housing, you said you anticipated what you called a robust housing package. What might that look like?
Yeah, I think it's two sides. One of it's always, at the end of the day, it's about increasing supply. We need more affordable units, and we just need more development and units overall, because it's not, affordability is essential. We know that we have a glut of demand, just an enormous amount of demand for affordable units, but it's about having more units in the system overall, because that has a downward pressure on prices for mortgages and for rents. And so it's about increasing supply, which is about money, helping affordable housing projects pencil out. We have great programs in place like Rental Housing Works. We have some community development funds that have been really helpful. Bernie, strategic demolition, helping to defray a lot of the costs so that they don't have to be borne by the developer, that they can be sort of taken out of the pro forma so that these affordable housing projects pencil out. Because what's important for everybody to remember is that it costs the same to build an affordable housing project as it does to build a market. It's the same sticks and mortar, it's the same concrete. It's just, so you have to be a little bit more thoughtful in the financing of affordable housing to have those units available. And so we need to put additional funds towards affordable housing. And then when it comes to development writ large, to increase supply, there are policy changes around upzoning and things about increasing development around transit stations that are policy changes that we can make that will make it less costly to develop additional housing units and will thereby decrease prices.
There's been some interest in from advocates of providing healthcare to undocumented residents in Maryland. Is that something that's on the radar for the Senate this year?
Look, this is an important issue. We are in Maryland are very fortunate. We have one of the lowest rates of uninsured in the country. And that's because we've been very thoughtful. We've had folks like Senator Feldman, who's our chair of our EEE committee, who had efforts around tax checkoff to get people enrolled into healthcare programs through the exchange. This is something I am very, very supportive of, opening up the exchange to all Marylanders. The real question, though, is about affordability. And this is where the rubber hits the road, is that, for a number of individuals who are within that 6%, The challenge that they have is that the plans that are available to them today, whether in the exchange or not, are not affordable. And so that's the context, and I think there have been other efforts about expanding access to the exchange, which is important and is something I've personally supported. That doesn't actually expand access to healthcare if it's inaffordable in the exchange. And that's where I think we're gonna have to figure out where we go from here, because we're in a budget environment that's very, very tight. And so, in a world of inexhaustible resources, it would be an easy answer. But we have a lot of competing pressures. And so if it's just focused on the exchange, I think that's a little bit of an easier conversation. I just don't know that solves the problem of expanding the number of uninsured Marylanders.
Mr. President, as you say, the budget environment is very tight. I noticed this morning at the event, no one was ruling out the possibility of tweaking the Maryland blueprint. How do you take care of the concerns of the counties and the school districts and still protect the intent of the original law?
Well, I think the thing is that this is a really robust and complex law. There are lots of different features, from expanding early childhood education to expanding teacher pay. So if you just talk about expanding teacher pay on its own, that's pretty simple. It's just dollars and cents. There's a negotiation. There's a dollar amount that you're trying to achieve. It costs some amount of money. It's pretty easy. The bigger challenge comes around places like early childhood and around the allocation of resources for students who have the biggest challenges towards learning. These are technical education finance issues that each district does differently. And so when I think about what changes are possible, really what we've suggested out of the Senate side is that the AIB and Maryland State Department of Education are best suited to have the intricacies of how the blueprint is playing out in each and every jurisdiction. And what we would like AIB and MSD to do is to collaborate to recommend structural changes that would be needed for specific jurisdictions or for jurisdictions overall as this law is implemented, to make sure that it is being implemented with fidelity and as cost effectively as possible. And so I'm hopeful that we'll have a piece of legislation from AIB and MSD this year that will help in some of those areas. I don't think there's a writ large issue of kind of pulling things back. I don't see the counties having a big cost increase this year. It's as we further, it's the out years that things get a little bit tighter.
Do you need to deal legislatively this year with the issue of teacher pay?
I think we're going to move forward with teacher pay, and even you go down to St. Mary's. This is one that's really important to get to that 60,000 base level. I mean, fundamentally, you have great schools because you have great teachers, and you have to have great. There are a lot of teachers who have been expected to sacrifice, and the idea of like the teacher working many hours or buying their own supplies. I mean, that's crazy. That's not going to get you a good system. If you want great teachers, you got to pay them. And so I think we have to absolutely stay on the path towards the 60,000. And you don't want jurisdictions poaching off of one another, which will happen because they can go above the 60,000. But at least we have a threshold level, especially for Eastern Shore and Western Maryland that have other states on the borders. What we hear from places like St. Mary's and on the Eastern Shore is that a lot of Delaware teachers, great Delaware teachers and West Virginia and Pennsylvania teachers are coming to Maryland because they're seeing the increase of teacher prices. Now, we still have a supply issue, but we're seeing it start to work. And so I think it's important that we stay there, at least on making sure that we're paying teachers and that we hold them to high standards. I mean, the money comes with additional standards.
Mr. President, you spent the last few years dealing with Supreme Court rulings and responding to them. Last year's was the end of affirmative action in higher education. I believe there's 2 pre-filed bills that deal with admissions. Will something pass? What do you think it'll look like? What are you guys going to take out? Yeah,
look, I've been working very closely with our President Pro Tem, Malcolm Augustine, who's been really kind of leading the way on this. I know also Alonzo Washington has been, Senator Alonzo Washington from Prince George has been working hard on this issue as well. Right now, we're looking at a mechanism of looking at kind of the top 5 to 10% of each high school having an entrance process. We're working with the University of Maryland system to make sure that we design a program that makes sense. I think it's absolutely essential that we have universities that reflect our diverse state. It makes the universities better, it makes the student bodies better, it gives everybody a better chance to interact with those who may have different experiences than them. And so, before the Supreme Court case, I think there were only 2 institutions in Maryland that were using race, and those that did, the one that was using it in the University of Maryland system was using it as one of 26 measures. So it's not likely that the Supreme Court case will have an enormous impact on the admissions process here in the state of Maryland. But if there are additional tools that can be offered or provided to ensure that we have a diverse higher education system in Maryland. I think the majority of folks in Maryland, in the Maryland Senate support it.
Mr. President, we know that some neighborhoods in Maryland are safer than others. And that is because of decades of decisions made by government actors, not necessarily during your time.
I hope not, but
But what I want to understand is, are you in favor of increasing penalties on minors who pick up an illegal gun because they feel it is the only way to keep themselves safe? And is it fair to do that when the previous governments also failed to keep their neighborhoods safe?
it's a tough question, right? I mean, I think this is the crux of it. At the end of the day, kids can't carry guns, and we have to get away from this idea that you are safer if you have a gun. And that sounds so hard to say out loud, because I know that there are kids that are scared going to and from school. I used to teach kids I always say all the time that the 9th, 10th, and 11th graders that I taught at Southwestern High School, it was harder for them to and from every day getting to school than it was anything that I had experienced in my life at that point as a 22-year-old teacher in front of them. And so, you know, I'm always very mindful of the lived experience being different. But we are in a crisis with firearms, and I think we have got to have a different approach when it comes to the possession and use of firearms, particularly by young people. And so we have a job to keep them safe. We should be focusing on whatever it takes to make them feel safe to and from school, wherever they are. But I do think it's never going to be okay for kids to be carrying a gun. All right. Well, thank you. Good news. We have a new vendor in the State House, Sprouts. So thanks to Sally Robb for her great work in getting that to happen. So hopefully, as you all are here, you have a new vendor